Good evening from Rocky Mountain PBS. I'm Cynthia Hessen. This is Colorado State of Mind. Tonight, as the election year marches on with ever-increasing intensity, we're taking a fresh look at one of the perennial issues, claims of widespread voter registration fraud versus accusations of deliberate voter suppression. 2012 has brought a lot of activity in this area, including defeat of a voter ID proposal in the Colorado legislature not long ago. This week, the Department of Justice sued the state of Florida, as it has previously sued North Carolina and Texas for possible violation of the Federal Voting Rights Act. What Governor Rick Scott is fighting to do there is purge from the voting rolls about 2,700 people who the state says may not be legal citizens. Florida itself is suing the Department of Homeland Security for refusing to share information that might identify other illegal immigrants. And that is information Colorado's Secretary of State is also seeking from DHS. Scott Gessler is with us tonight, and we'll find out more. Concern over who is eligible to vote and to what extent ineligible people are casting ballots always comes around to an argument about potential minority disenfranchisement because in Florida, for example, more than 85% of those people, the 2,700 people, are Latino or black and may in fact be citizens. It's not clear. The American Civil Liberties Union has carved out a major role in suing to protect civil rights in these cases. So also with us tonight is Denise Mays from the ACLU of Colorado. There are plenty of citizen watchdog groups which keep a close eye on everything involving voting rights and electoral process, and tonight Jessica Peck is here representing a website called Open Government Institute, which is a clearinghouse of information on government transparency and fair elections, among other things. And rounding out our panel, Alicia Caldwell of the Denver Post editorial board. They also keep tabs on these issues of voter registration and, of course, the politics at the heart of it. So, Mr. Secretary of State, I'll start with you. It's part of your job, of course, to make sure that the voting rolls are kept up to date and current. You chose last fall to sue the Denver County Clerk because she was sending ballots to people who had not participated in 2010, even though the standard before this has not been to stop sending ballots to people who don't participate in one election. And in the past, of course, you've promoted more stringent voter ID, like perhaps even birth certificates being necessary for voters. I know that this makes you part of this group of officials in many different states, Republican officials by and large, who are concerned about voter fraud and the extent to which it is a problem. So what kind of evidence do you see that causes you concern here in Colorado?
Well, I think it's important to say it's both, you have to have concerns about voter fraud, but also mistake as well. Because mistake is non-intentional, but it still results in a problem. So there's a lot of different areas to look at. But for example, when you talk about people voting twice, we recently got really good evidence, including signature matches of people who voted twice, both in Colorado and Kansas. So a handful of people, but that's only one state. When you look at non-citizens on our voter rolls, we did a study last year, and we identified thousands of people, several thousands of people who were non-citizens, proved that they were non-citizens when they got their driver's license, but are also registered on the voter rolls. Now, I'm sure some of those are perfectly legal. Someone registered to vote, became a citizen, and then registered to vote. But I think a portion of those are illegal registrants. And what buttresses that argument is in the last 3 or 4 years, we've, statewide, had about 450 people who have either filled out voter registration forms saying that they're not a citizen, trying to register to vote, or have written letters to us saying, please remove me from the voter rolls because I'm not a citizen and I shouldn't be on the voter rolls. I think a lot of that is probably a mistake. When you look at voter registration, about six years ago or so in Colorado, there were several high-profile cases of people who were registering fraudulently, people who were prosecuted and convicted as well. And then every year in mail ballot elections in particular, you'll have people who return ballots and their signatures don't match the originals on file. Sometimes that's innocent. You know, someone may, for example, they're right-handed and their right hand's in a cast, so they have to sign left-handed. So some of that's legitimate, but some of it's not as well. So that's an indicia of problems. And then finally, you know, a lot of times mail ballots in particular will go out to people who no longer live at that address, and so you sort of have live ballots floating out there, and that creates an opportunity for mischief. And then most recently in Pueblo, actually there were about 116 people that the clerk sent dual ballots to, sent 2 ballots to. And if someone comes back twice, that's a problem as well.
And I think a lot of those mistakes that you're mentioning there, then where dual ballots have been sent out, or where there's concern when something comes back if the signature matches and so forth, those all seem exactly what people in your position should be concerned about. But let me turn to Denise Mays. The ACLU has been concerned about some of these things, certainly not the mistakes, but where large groups of minority voters might be targeted to be taken off the rolls and might be citizens. You've actually campaigned against, I think, photo ID. Why is that such a hardship on people? We have to use photo ID on numbers of things.
Well, that's a good one for you to raise, Cynthia. I think the idea of photo ID, and frankly, it doesn't only disproportionately burden and affect minority voters, but it also has an effect on the elderly, for example, and also people with disabilities. I think that many of us here around the table can just take for granted, yeah, we have a photo ID, but the fact of the matter is not a lot of people do, and it's not necessarily very easy to access. And I think that's a particular reason why you wouldn't want a photo ID as an immediate requirement. And when you say that there are photos that are required for a lot of things, I think that becomes a real common statement. But the fact of the matter is that the right to vote is indeed a fundamental right. Getting on an airplane, that's a privilege, not a right. Buying cigarettes or liquor, that is a privilege, not a right. And so the distinction between those things that we do need a photo ID for and requiring it for voting, they're not comparable.
Jessica, let me ask Jessica, to the extent that you've analyzed public policy in this area and taken a look at it, how big a problem do you think it really is that people who shouldn't be voting are voting?
Well, in your opening, Cynthia, you were the distinction was between voter fraud and voter suppression. And I think the debate is a lot more complicated than that. The vast majority of mistakes that I see are indeed about mistakes, not about fraud. So what happened to me, I ran for state senate, the tender age of 25. Didn't have any skeletons in the closet. There was no Facebook when I was in college. There were no parties that I didn't want anybody to find out about. But I had moved. When I was 18, I left Jefferson County, then I moved to Boulder, then I moved to Washington, D.C., and then back to Colorado. And a couple weeks before the election, my opposition came out with a smear campaign, and these were mail pieces sent to close to 100,000 households in my district. And it said, Jessica, the Great Disappearing Act. Because I'd only voted in half the elections I'd been eligible to vote in. And as it turns out, they were calculating every jurisdiction where I was still registered. And over the years, I'd been registered at up to as many as 3 of those 4. So here I am saying I voted. The only election that I did not vote in was a mail ballot. I think it was in a May or March or something for city council in Boulder. That was it.
So should all of those jurisdictions have taken you off the roll as soon as you didn't vote in the next election?
I think so, because it didn't just stop there. I was getting federal jury service notifications in Washington, D.C. I was having major tax issues with the state of Colorado because they said, you're still registered to vote here, you're still a resident. These are much bigger problems than just a couple people walking up and grabbing mail ballots out of a trash can and filling them out and sending them in. These are about our this is about identity. This is about how our government treats us. And as far as voter ID, I agree that voting is a fundamental right. And we do need to be very careful about how we approach that. And I supported the voter ID bill because I think the right to vote is fundamental. And we don't want anybody else. We need to have safeguards to prevent people from violating our rights by taking our ballots. But if you look at the states that have implemented voter ID requirements, voter turnout in the same minority communities and elderly communities we just heard about have actually gone up.
I would actually disagree with that. But
all right, let's come back to that too.
Well, to your question about the proportion of fraud, I think the Florida experience is instructive when you look at the number of people initially identified and then the number of people who actually have been found, at least as recently as a couple of days ago, to have been on the rolls illegally. It went from thousands to 141 non-citizens who are on the voter registration rolls to 47 who actually cast ballots. Now, Florida is a big state. We're talking about 11.3 million registered voters. So we're talking about a very small proportion of people. But the lists that those supervisors of elections were getting were so unreliable that they found themselves in the position of kicking people off the rolls who were not only legitimately here, but legitimately registered to vote. So I think that's really the core issue, not whether, I don't think you get much disagreement that people who are not citizens should not be on the rolls. The question is how you appropriately deny people the right to vote, as we've said, it's
and whether
a
you're
fundamental right.
sweeping real citizens
Exactly.
into it.
Well, right, and I think that what has happened in Florida is a really perfect example of this. I think that when the story originally broke, Florida was talking about over 100,000 people that were presumably ineligible to vote that were on the voter rolls, and then suddenly that number came whittled down to somewhere in the number that you gave, which is close to 4,000. 1,500 of which were in one county alone, and they've already shown, and this is only up to date, 500 of those 1,500 have legitimately shown that they are actually eligible voters. That's a 30% error rate. That doesn't give me a lot of confidence in the ability of
That's not quite what's going on in Florida. What's going on in Florida is they've identified a universe, okay, of potential problems or potentially perfectly legal voters. And what they've been able to do is actually confirm only a very small number of that universe.
Which is why they want Homeland Security.
That's the reason
to
they're
help.
suing Department of Homeland Security, and we're in the same boat. Because in Colorado, we don't even have access to the juror recusal rolls. So, for example, Florida is able to get some of that. And so what Florida wants to be able to do, and I think what we want to do in other states, is to be able to have the information to make that determination. Really what's going on is you have this big universe where there's concerns about it. And you have a very, very small universe that you're actually able to confirm one way or the other. So it's not that the number has shrunk, it's that we only have knowledge about a very small portion. So if you look at North Carolina, for example, they did a study and they had a universe of about 600 that they looked at, comparing to their driver's license rolls. Of that 600, about a third wrote back, they sent letters, a third wrote back and said, I'm a citizen, here's my information. About a third, my numbers may be a little rough, but about a third of that 600 wrote back and said, I'm not a citizen, please remove me. And then the remainder, they're prosecuting. So really what's going on is not that Florida makes this big number and the reality is different. That's not what's going on. What's going on is Florida says this large number and only has the information to confirm a very small portion. And that's the problem I think we have, is the lack of detection and the lack of capabilities to do this analysis.
Well, while I've got you here, I'll ask you, we had a story about a year and a half ago that you have access to DHS databases to confirm whether notaries are citizens. And there's nothing apparently in the statute that keeps you from using that database to look at the citizenship of people you suspect may be non-citizen voters. What's the fly in the ointment there?
Well, maybe I should hire you as my attorney to have that conversation with the Department of Homeland Security. And I say that teasingly. Look, I mean, we're very constrained in what we can do with various databases, and so we got to follow the law there. One of the laws of the Department of Homeland Security, and this is the one that Florida is looking at, and in fact, we sort of told Florida about this, but says that they have to provide verification information about citizenship whenever we ask for a reason. So it's a little different statute than the Notary Public. And Department of Homeland Security has said, no, you're not allowed to do this, at least at this point. We may be able to break through that. I'm unwilling to essentially lie to Department of Homeland Security, and I know you're not asking me to do that, but I'm not willing to say, well, we're going to pretend this is for Notary Public, but it's really for voting registration. So it's very narrow what we can do. So, for example, states can do it for law enforcement, but Department of Homeland Security, at least to date, has taken the position that you're not allowed to do it for voter registration issues.
So will you sue DHS as well?
We're considering all of our options, and that's definitely on the table.
Break some news, Scott.
Yeah, that's definitely on the table. We may very well do that. We're making I'll tell you, we're making a last-ditch effort to try and cooperate and convince Department of Homeland Security to cooperate with us. We're taking a different approach than Florida is. But my whole thing is, Look, I don't care if the number of legal, or I should say non-legal voter registration people is 1 or 0 or 10,000. I'm not looking for a number. I just want the information to be able to get that.
Well, I think that this entire discussion begs the question of why are we looking at this at all? I mean, this really does seem to be kind of a solution in search of a problem. I mean, I think even under the Bush administration, the Bush administration did a pretty elaborate study on trying to discern the numbers of individuals who voted fraudulently, or just the voter fraud issue in general, and frankly, there was simply not a problem.
That's not true. The only study that was done, the only study that was done.
Let me just finish. I mean,
all right, and then let me talk about that study.
Absolutely, and I think if you think about it, I mean, the idea of one individual voting when they are ineligible to vote, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? It's the least significant way to influence an ultimate decision with one vote,
that you can be
and you
prosecuted
risk very serious criminal penalties, especially in a federal election. So it just seems to me we're spending a lot of time and a lot of energy trying to shrink the right to vote, as opposed to what I think we should be doing is talking about how we can broaden the franchise.
What about the study?
The study under the Bush Commission, there was one.
Right, yes, there was one.
It was done by the GSA. Okay.
I thought it was the Election Assistance Commission, but
not on that issue.
You're right. The
Not
EAC did do one, but this might be a separate one.
Yeah, the main study was done by the GSA, and actually I think it may have been before the Bush administration. And all that they did is they surveyed federal circuit courts and circuit courts for jury panels and get their information from voter rolls. And they asked circuit court administrators to estimate. And it was between 0 and 3%. But look, in Colorado, in the last 3-4 years, okay, we've had 450 people voluntarily remove themselves from the voter rolls, or voluntarily try and register and say, I'm not a citizen.
Right,
but Jared
so there's no voter fraud, is my point.
That's not true.
Well, those
we
450, though, are working
and some
to
of those
comply with the law.
450 voted in the election. Okay?
And what's the evidence of that?
We look at the voter rolls and we compare their name to it when they asked to be removed from the voter rolls, and they voted, and then they write us a letter and they say, I'm not a citizen.
I mean, I'm sure that you've heard of the rule of, you know, there's the birthday rule, and then, I mean,
no.
there's the fact that names that
if
are...
someone says, here's my name and here's my address, please remove me from the voter rolls, and we remove that person from the voter rolls, and we look at their record, and they have voted in 2 elections, that's improper.
Okay.
Okay.
And you have documentation of that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
In fact,
I would love to see that.
There's a website that recently published a lot of that. But here's the thing. We have 450 people like that who voluntarily remove themselves from the voter rolls, some of whom voted. I don't have an exact number of whom voted, okay? But I could probably get that to you, of that number.
Yeah, I'd like
Jared
to see
Polis, current congressman, he started his political career in a statewide race that he won by 90 votes. All right. Bob Beaupre in 2002, that was in 2000. In 2002, Bob Beaupre won a congressional race by 121 votes. Every year we have either a state senate race or a state house race that's normally every year we have one that's decided by less than 100 votes.
On that note too, I ran a statewide campaign that we got 49% of the vote. We were just 1/2 of
So you're saying it matters.
It does matter.
If 2 dozen voters can decide something. But this comes then to the politics of it, right? Where you're being accused.
And the fairness of it.
Yes, and Republican officials are being accused of trying to purge the rolls of voters who they think, you know, might lean more Democratic in elections.
You have to look at statistics here too, because the majority of secretaries of state in this country are Republicans, and in the majority of the states with the most contentious ballots, many of the targeted states this season have Republican secretaries of state. So that's part of it. That's a natural consequence of the current party affiliation. But to get back to your point, or the question about why are we searching for a solution when we haven't identified the problem, this is a big problem, and it is not a partisan problem. If you look at communications director for the Colorado Democrats, Mr. Enzio, he had the same thing happen. He remained on the ballot, or he remained a registered voter in Washington, D.C., moved back here, and conservative advocates jumped at him saying, you're illegally registered, and of course it's not his fault, it's not his burden to take himself off, but there's no communication between the jurisdictions. Now that this story has been publicized, what's to stop somebody from walking into a polling place on election day and taking his information. They know he's not going to be there. They sure as heck know he's not going to vote.
Okay, but in a widespread way, how could people know what name to use if they wanted to try and pull something like that?
Examples just like that. Or I now do mail-in voting, which I hate, but it's easier, so it's become sort of a byproduct of a need for convenience and time saving. I have seen when I have gone in on day when I voted on actually election day, and the election judges have people's information out there.
I don't think we should be creating public policy on the hypothetical maybe that somebody might in one day, in 1 year, do what you're describing. I mean, this is my whole point. Is if there was actual documented evidence that this is occurring, then sure. I mean, the ACLU certainly. I certainly don't want to go on record as saying that it's an everyone vote approach. I understand the need for eligible voters, and I understand the need, and I understand that your role as a government official is to make sure that the rolls are in fact tight and accurate and legal. But again, you're bringing up hypotheticals.
No, I'm bringing up anecdotes, right? How many anecdotes does it take for something to become a trend that's so concerning that we evaluate our public policy and say we need to make changes? I covered as a reporter in 2000 and 2004 the presidential election races. There was widespread fraud, widespread in Milwaukee, where people were just handing out ballots. But this is a fact. So these are anecdotes, and it's very hard to detect voter fraud. That's one of the huge problems here. It's not like we can look at incarceration rates or we have cameras on the side of a highway to catch people.
But wasn't there a follow-up study on that Wisconsin election that found that it was far less than 1%?
Exactly.
How do you know? How do you know? That's the problem.
What happened in Wisconsin is that the Wisconsin police did an investigation where it was about a 63, 65-page investigation. And what they said is that there were about 4,000 to 5,000, they didn't know the exact number, more voters in Milwaukee more votes that were counted than people who voted on election day. That's what they determined. Now, they couldn't prosecute anyone because the line between fraud and incompetence in that instance was very slim. I mean, people said, well, this wasn't fraudulent, it was just incompetent. That was in the 2004 presidential election. So in the city of Milwaukee, you had between 4,000 and 5,000. They didn't have an exact number. And that state was won by John Kerry in the presidential election by 11,000 votes. So you can't say it's insubstantial, nor can you say it's hypothetical. The frustration I have sometimes with the debate, and I think you characterize it, is a lot of times people will immediately attack motivations. You're trying to do this, you're trying to do that.
On both sides.
I think that does happen on both sides, and it's unfortunate when it does. But you look at the evidence where it leads you, and, you know, I mean, look, we identified that we were dead bang sure. We had signature matches, the whole deal, of 6 people who voted in Kansas and Colorado. And immediately, sort of folks on the opposite end of the political spectrum said, oh, it's just 6, that doesn't matter, this is ridiculous, da-da-da-da-da. And we turned it over to the FBI months ago, and there's been no prosecution. So there's no desire, at least in that sector, to pursue any of this. And even when you identify people, some people, their immediate reaction is sort of to downplay it and say it doesn't matter. And I've seen the arguments where people will say, well, that's just a little, or it's not organized, or it didn't affect the outcome of the election, or why are we even talking about this? We should be talking about something else. So the debate shifts. You know, sometimes there's attack motivations, but there is evidence out there, and I think you have to realistically look at it.
I think that when there is very specific, targeted evidence, that's exactly when you should move forward, not on a speculative, kind of broad, well, we think there may be sort of, kind of, particularly if those actions would take people off the rolls if they don't show their papers and prove who they are.
Precisely.
Then you start getting into larger problems with denying people rights just based on a suspicion. And that's a real issue.
That's correct. Because
I
certainly
reasonable suspicions. Look,
what's reasonable?
Well, here's the deal. Someone, and we'll talk about the driver's license analysis. When someone within the last several years proved that they're a non-citizen, okay? They've proved that they're a non-citizen. So there's a presumption that they're a non-citizen, all right, when they got their driver's license. And we have thousands and thousands of people. You can't tell me, based on the other stuff I know, you cannot tell me that every single one of them is legally registered to vote. You can't do that. You can't say it's 100% perfectly accurate, that no one ever did that mistake, especially when I have 450 people where it's just the opposite. And so I think that is perfectly enough evidence to further investigate. Not to take them off the rolls, but to investigate. And there's ways to investigate. look at juror recusal rolls, look at prison and jail records where this information comes up. I mean, you have to provide citizenship to be on welfare, to get welfare benefits, to be able to contact Department of Homeland Security, or maybe to send people letters and say, look, we want to be able to verify this because you've shown that evidence in the past. So yes, you can take action, not necessarily immediately removing people from the voter rolls, but take normal, basic precautions that are used in every day of our lives, in every other area, to make sure that this stuff is accurate. Because I agree, voting is a fundamental right, and I admit, I'm originally from Chicago, and there's a lot of people whose fundamental rights, I think, were fundamentally diluted year in and year out. Because of widespread vote fraud.
Before we run out of time, Jessica, you asserted that in elections after some of these purges have been made and things have been cleaned up, there's a bigger turnout. Denise said she didn't agree with that.
Right. I mean, the New York Times just did a study, I think it was last fall, that conclusively stated that was absolutely incorrect. I think what they did in states where there were laws like photo IDs.
Indiana and Georgia?
They did. Indiana and Georgia. And what they found is that, and a lot of folks that say voter turnout was actually fine or greater always rely on the 2008 election. Well, of course, because we had the highest numbers of people voting all across the board. And so that's what people point to when they talk about Indiana and Georgia.
But the ID requirement was not an impediment there. People found a way to get an ID.
We don't know that. We don't know that in a normal in a normal turnout year, in an average turnout year. What the New York Times study clearly concludes
in the most
is
recent
that
election, there was not a pattern, a documented pattern of minorities or the populations you're talking about at risk for not having IDs.
Right,
just that they were less likely to vote.
That is not your average voter turnout year,
Well,
which is
no
my
such
whole
thing
point.
as an average voter turnout.
Actually,
You know
there
what?
is.
I'm so sorry. As you can see, there's a lot more we could go on. Thank you all so much, but we are out of time for Colorado State of Mind for this week. You may see this program again if you go online to video.rmpbs.org. Thank you now to Alicia Caldwell and to Secretary of State Scott Gessler, also to Jessica Peck and Denise Mays for their thoughts tonight on voter registration. And thank you for watching. Join us again next weekend for Colorado State of Mind. I'm Cynthia Hessen. Good night.
Republicans are going to prevail, especially after a very tough couple cycles. They need to pick up that 30%, at least a huge chunk of it. So that's going to include elderly people, minorities, and this isn't just about the stereotypical, uptight conservative white guy. This is about reaching out to other constituencies that have either abandoned the Republican Party or who have never voted Republican.